Well, I think we should just carry on with the theme of democracy in a slightly different light. We've just gone through the referendum on the alternative vote, which gave a very resounding no to that. But Ruth Lea, you have founded something called the People's Pledge, which wants a referendum on what is certainly a bigger issue than that, which is Britain's continued membership of the European Union itself. Could I just ask where the idea came from, how the People's Pledge got going in the first place?
Well, there were several of us, and actually the emphasis is very much on the left of the political spectrum rather than the right, which is interesting. The director of the People's Pledge is someone, Mark Seddon, who used to write for Tribune. The chairman is John Mills, and then we have John Cryer. We actually have a member of the RMT, Marr and Denis, supporting the People's Pledge, and I must admit I don't agree with the tube strikes either, but there we go. And Jenny Jones and Carolyn Lucas of the Green Party, and then we have
people like yourself would be from the political right.
Of the political right, Zach Goldsmith and Dan Hannan and myself and various others. So I think it wasn't, the idea was that we missed our referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. In fact, we had been promised, if you remember, of course, a referendum on the Constitution, Giscard d'Estaing's Constitution, but then when France and the Netherlands, of course, voted against it, then it came forward, it was sort of changed into the Lisbon Treaty, and then the referendum promise was reneged.
And you have to be 54 years old, is that right, to have voted in a referendum on Europe?
Because it was 1975, and I think you had to be 18 at the time.
Right.
And I remember I was eligible. I admit to my age in that respect, but I was a civil servant at the time, and I never even thought it mattered. Can you believe that? And I'm sure Dennis will smile, given my sort of reputation for Euroscepticism since. But I really felt at the time the whole political class, or a lot of the political class at the time, felt that actually membership of the EEC was actually a no-brainer. It had to be.
But the EU has changed so much that you regard that it's important that we have to have a referendum again.
Not least of all for some of the reasons that Dennis was saying. You had the period of the 1980s when you had the single market, which was being pushed by Lord Cockfield as well as Mitterrand, and then, of course, the single currency of the 1990s, Maastricht and Amsterdam and Nice, and last but not least, of course, the Lisbon Treaty. And I think it's changed out of all recognition from what it was in the 1970s. But of course, in Britain, we always thought it was something like a free trade area. We were told that. That, of course, was never the case, because if you go way back to the Treaty of Rome, this was about the ever-increasing unification of the peoples of Europe.
Yet, the European issue, rather oddly at the moment, apart from the euro and the troubles in Greece and so on, is not much on the agenda. You might have thought, with the Conservative Party being the dominant figure in a coalition, and everyone says the most Eurosceptic Conservative parliamentary party ever elected, that Europe would be a big issue in this country. Now, maybe it's simply because of the coalition's own stresses and strains over this, but it's a subject that simply hasn't been much discussed over the last year.
I think that's true. I think the trouble is with the European issues that they are very hard to focus on. You can focus on the economy, you can focus on public finance, you can focus on health, all those things, but the thing about the EU, of course, it affects everything right across the board, but it's hard to pick out as an issue. But I think you're right that within the parliamentary Conservative Party, and I'm sure Dennis is familiar with these people as well as I am, there is a terrific Euroscepticism, but Cameron himself, actually, I think, if I may use the word, ambivalent about Europe. He, of course, did say at some point that he'd be talking about withdrawing from the social chapter, which was never on the cards as far as I was concerned.
Well, and for any leader, Europe gives them another platform and another stage on which to perform, and a certain amount of extra heft in the world as well. So,
well, I think politicians do like, if I may say so, strutting around on the world stage, and just thinking of a country like Switzerland. The Swiss politicians, the political class in Switzerland, would love to be in the EU, absolutely dying to be in the EU, and no doubt the Norwegians as well. But, of course, they have a system of referenda within Switzerland. They've always balked the idea of actually joining the EU. So people themselves don't want it. That there is a disconnect between what politicians like and what people want, I think.
Proposition, Ruth Lea, as so long as we've got a coalition, we're not going to have a referendum on Europe.
Well, maybe, but I have to say this, that there was one party, and there's one party leader, of course, that did promise that there would be a referendum on the EU. His name was Nicholas Clegg, if my memory serves me correctly.
That's right.
And, of course, the irony about the People's Pledge, as I was saying, I gave this list of names across the political board that we got on side, but we've not managed to attract any Liberal Democrats yet. But
Dennis, would it be a good thing for this country, perhaps, to have a proper referendum and a proper debate about this? Because it's so many people are cross about this and feel that the British have been denied a proper democratic say. Get it over with. Get it done. One way or another.
Just gone through a plebiscite, and that really raised the tone and the quality and the culture of political discourse. No insults. There was a calm, rational explanation. It was a moment of political education. I mean, frankly, AV and first past the post, it's like Gulliver's Travels, whether you have cracked the egg at the big or the little end.
Well, I think that's what people felt, wasn't it? After
and it was reduced to kind of ghastly smears and half-lies and personal attacks. I mean, I was ashamed. I nearly didn't vote, and actually that's the majority result of the British people. The majority of us just said, no thanks, we don't want this wretched plebiscite. Does a referendum clear any air? My fairly firm belief is that if it really is in or out, then I think Ruth's establishment, even the hedge funds and the people who don't like Europe, would say, actually, out, disconnect from the open market, disconnect from 900,000 British citizens living in Spain, disconnect from free travel, Erasmus.
Well, would we disconnect from these things, actually?
No, you wouldn't disconnect any more than Switzerland or Norway does, but they have to pay proportion to their budgets, just as much as we do to the
they
EU.
Don't pay anything like. They
I'm
don't.
sorry.
The Swiss have actually...
This is one of the difficulties. I lived in Switzerland for 15 years.
The Swiss
and
government
Ruth,
has said...
if I may, Ruth,
not.
I lived in the country for 15 years. When I lived there, no European could buy a property in Switzerland. Now they're all allowed to. There's open borders. They have to give money to help East Europe. And so if we leave, we'd have all the obligations and responsibilities, none of the rights and
Ruth's
privileges.
turn.
But this is an argument that's...
Ruth's turn.
I'm afraid the Swiss government has come out and said quite clearly that if they were a member of the EU, they'd be paying substantially more into Brussels than with their current relationship, which is one of free trade. And they're in Schengen. And the fact that also they have certain mutually beneficial bilateral agreements, but they have actually said that, and I can give you the reference. Now,
I know you don't want anyone to interpose themselves in this interesting argument. Michael Craig Martin is going to do it nonetheless.
It just seemed to me with the recent AV vote that this was described as a complicated issue, and the reason why it was such a problem was because the general public didn't really understand it. Well, if the general public doesn't understand AV, that a vote on the European Union is truly doomed to misunderstanding, because it's a much harder thing to grasp.
I think that's been really very hard on people. I think people have got more instinctive understanding of these issues than you give them credit for.
Well, I started my political
And what about
life...
democracy? Democracy, we actually elect people like Denis Macshane to be our representatives.
I actually love Parliament and I hate plebiscites. I started my political life campaigning against the call for a referendum restoring capital punishment. That was the passion of the time. Bring back capital punishment. I said no. I believe firmly Parliament, as any kid, had abolished it. Let our decisions rest with Parliament, not with the press, not with plebiscites.
Well, I'm going to bring Kutlu
then I think we should have the referendum.
just for a moment on this subject before we turn to his art, because, of course, it's a huge issue in Turkey, isn't it, still? Do you think Turkey will ever join the EU? Would it be a good thing or a bad thing if they did?
Well, my feeling... until 2 years ago, I used to believe that Turkey was going to join the EU, but it's changing now, obviously, because the economy is improving in Turkey, and we didn't have the impact of the crisis as much as you had it in Europe. So it's changing. The general public is questioning the idea of
It's not necessary for Turkey
EU.
to join the EU to continue to be a successful democracy.
Well, at the same time, it is the idea of EU, of course, is very important because it creates this impetus for change, for democratization in Turkey. Because in order to join in the EU, you have to democratize, you have to change the country. So it has this double side. And I also have a kind of a double position on this because I hold dual citizenship. So as a UK citizen, I feel like, we should, strengthen our relationship with Germany and try to change EU from within rather than isolate ourselves. But as a Turkish person, I am doubtful that we should be part of the EU, maybe.
Splendid. I think that's absolutely excellent conclusion to come to. I mean, this idea that one has to be in the EU and then you have lots and lots of influence on the EU. Britain has tried that ever since we remember back in 1972. And frankly, I don't think the EU is where we would like it to be.